When Melania Trump walked into a high-profile leadership summit and completely turned the tables on an aggressive interviewer, what started as a routine discussion quickly became a masterclass in composure, strategy, and quiet power. Did she evade tough questions, or did she outmaneuver one of the sharpest interviewers? The London Global Leadership Summit was one of the most anticipated events of the year, drawing influential figures from politics, business, and media to discuss the future of leadership in a rapidly changing world. The Grand Hall of the Royal Lancaster Conference Centre buzzed with quiet anticipation as attendees took their seats, a mix of diplomats, executives, and journalists, each eager for the day's discussions. Among the scheduled speakers was Melania Trump, an unexpected but intriguing addition to the summit's panel on leadership and public influence. While many in the audience were curious about her perspective, others were skeptical. She had spent much of her time as First Lady maintaining a reserved and carefully controlled presence, often avoiding the political fray. Some wondered, would she finally break her silence on the controversies surrounding her past? At the center of the stage sat Richard Hale, a sharp and respected British political analyst, known for his ability to press even the most seasoned public figures into uncomfortable conversations. He had a reputation for asking the tough questions no one dared to, and today, with Melania in the hot seat, the audience expected nothing less than a revealing discussion. As the lights dimmed and the panelists took their places, the air crackled with anticipation. What started as a formal discussion on leadership was about to become one of the most talked-about moments of the entire summit. Richard Hale adjusted his microphone, flashing a polite but knowing smile as he turned toward Melania Trump. The audience leaned in slightly, sensing that the conversation was about to begin. "Mrs. Trump, it's a pleasure to have you here today," he said smoothly. "You've remained somewhat private since your time in the White House. What led you to accept this invitation to speak on leadership?" Melania, poised and composed, offered a small, deliberate nod. "Thank you, Richard. Leadership is not just about politics. It is about influence, responsibility, and the ability to inspire. I have spent years working to help children, focusing on education and well-being. I believe in leading by example, not just with words." Her answer was measured, diplomatic, but Richard wasn't here for rehearsed statements. He leaned forward slightly. "That's admirable, but as a former First Lady, your role was more than philanthropy. You were in a unique position to shape public discourse. Many believe you chose silence instead. Do you regret not speaking out more?" A faint murmur ran through the audience. The question was pointed, though wrapped in civility. This was where most public figures might shift uncomfortably, search for the right words, or attempt to sidestep. But Melania remained perfectly still, her expression unreadable. She let the silence linger for just a moment before answering. "I believe actions speak louder than words," she said smoothly. "People may not always hear what I say, but they can see what I do." The conversation had officially begun. Richard Hale picked up his pen, tapping it lightly against the armrest of his chair. He had expected a diplomatic response, but Melania's composure was striking, controlled, deliberate. Not one to let an opportunity slip, he leaned in slightly. "That's an interesting philosophy," he said, his voice carrying a hint of challenge. "But wouldn't you agree that silence can also be seen as complicity? Many believe that as First Lady you had a responsibility to speak up on some of the most divisive issues of our time." A murmur rippled through the audience. This was what they had been waiting for. Would she finally address the criticism that had followed her for years? Melania sat perfectly still, her hands resting lightly in her lap. When she spoke, her voice remained even and unwavering. "It is easy to judge from the outside," she said simply, "but true leadership is not about making noise. It is about knowing when to listen, when to act, and when to rise above the distractions." Her response was calculated yet piercing, and for a brief moment Richard hesitated. He had expected a deflection or a softened acknowledgement, not a challenge. Still, he wasn't ready to back down. "But surely, Mrs. Trump," he pressed, "there were moments when you could have used your voice to take a stand." Melania's gaze never wavered. "And what of those who speak loudly but do nothing?" she countered. "Which is worse?" The room fell silent. The audience, some skeptical, some intrigued, absorbed the weight of her words. For the first time, it was Richard who seemed momentarily caught off guard. The narrative he had prepared, the one where she would falter under scrutiny, was beginning to slip from his grasp. Richard recovered quickly, adjusting in his seat, his sharp gaze fixed on Melania. He had faced seasoned politicians, CEOs, and world leaders before. He wasn't about to lose control of the conversation now. If she was going to deflect and reframe the discussion, he would push harder. "You make an interesting point, Mrs. Trump," he said, offering a calculated smile. "But let's address the elephant in the room. Your husband is one of the most polarizing figures in modern politics. Standing by him, through scandals, controversies, and criticism, has led many to question not only your beliefs, but your personal convictions. Do you ever regret your choice?" The entire room tensed. Some in the audience gasped softly, while others exchanged knowing glances. This was it. The moment where most public figures might crack, stumble, or show a flicker of discomfort. But Melania didn't flinch. Instead, she took a deliberate breath, then met Richard's gaze head-on. "Regret is for those who do not take responsibility for their choices," she said, her voice steady. "I know the life I chose, and I stand by it, not because it is easy, but because it is mine." The words hung in the air, their weight undeniable. Richard blinked, momentarily caught off guard. He had expected hesitation, a softened diplomatic response, not a firm and unapologetic declaration. A few members of the audience began to clap, then more followed. The energy in the room shifted. Melania was no longer just answering questions, she was commanding the space. The applause rippled through the room, some hesitant, some firm, as Richard worked to regain his footing. He had expected a moment of hesitation, perhaps even discomfort, but instead, Melania had taken control of the conversation. Rather than retreating, she leaned in slightly, her voice calm but deliberate. "People love to ask why I did not speak louder," she said, her gaze sweeping across the audience. "But perhaps the better question is, why do people feel the need to judge so loudly?" A hush fell over the room. She had flipped the conversation on its head, subtly but effectively putting the burden of scrutiny back onto those so eager to criticize. Richard opened his mouth, but before he could formulate a response, Melania continued. "It is easy to shout opinions from the outside, harder to step into someone's life and understand their choices. I focus on what I can control, my actions. The rest is just noise." For the first time, Richard hesitated. The conversation was no longer about his carefully planned questions. It was about how effortlessly she had dismantled them. Some audience members nodded in agreement, while others whispered among themselves, reevaluating their expectations. Richard adjusted his tie, his confidence slightly shaken, and offered a small, conceding nod. "That's certainly one way to look at it." But it was clear to everyone in the room, Melania Trump wasn't here to be tested, she was here to own the moment. The moment Melania finished speaking, the room erupted. Not in chaos, but in awe, admiration, and even surprise. Some audience members rose to their feet, clapping, while others whispered among themselves, processing the weight of her words. Richard Hale, usually the one in control, sat back in his chair, momentarily silent. His pen, which he had used so confidently throughout the conversation, now rested forgotten in his hand. This wasn't the reaction he had expected. He had pushed, he had provoked, but she had never faltered. Instead, she had turned his own tactics against him, not with aggression, but with sheer composure and presence. The applause continued, some hesitant but many genuinely impressed. Melania had done what few guests in Richard's chair had managed. She had dictated the pace of the conversation. By refusing to be rattled, she had shifted the narrative in real time. A journalist in the front row, scribbling furiously in her notepad, turned to her colleague. "This is going to be everywhere by morning." Indeed, as cameras captured the moment, clips were already being uploaded and shared on social media. Within minutes, headlines were forming. "Melania Trump stuns at Leadership Summit. a masterclass in composure. Melania turns the tables, how silence became her strongest weapon. For the first time that night, Richard exhaled, offering a small, reluctant smile. "I'll give you this," he said, nodding slightly. "You certainly know how to command a room." By the next morning, clips of Melania Trump's interview had flooded the internet, sparking an international debate. News outlets dissected every moment, from her calm yet sharp responses to the moment she flipped the conversation back on Richard Hale. Headlines ranged from praise to criticism. Melania Trump's poise leaves moderators speechless, a victory for Grace under fire. Did Melania evade tough questions, or was she in complete control? A masterclass in composure, or a missed opportunity for accountability? Social media was even more divided. Supporters applauded her for handling the interrogation with dignity, arguing that she had proven she was stronger than the media had ever given her credit for. Critics, however, claimed she sidestepped responsibility, using carefully crafted responses to avoid giving direct answers. Meanwhile, Richard Hale addressed the moment on his own program later that evening. "I'll admit," he told his audience, "I expected to control that conversation, but I underestimated her. She wasn't defensive, she wasn't combative, and yet somehow she won the room." Regardless of where people stood, one thing was clear: Melania Trump's interview had become a defining moment, proving that sometimes the most powerful statements are made without ever raising your voice. In the days following the summit, public perception of Melania Trump had shifted. For years, she had been seen as reserved, distant, even reluctant to step into the public eye. But now, her presence at the Global Leadership Summit told a different story, one of strategic composure, quiet strength, and the ability to command respect without ever raising her voice. Some argued that her responses had been calculated deflections, a way to sidestep accountability while maintaining control, but others saw something different. A woman who had spent years being scrutinized, underestimated, and misinterpreted, finally showing the world that silence is not weakness, but a choice. Richard Hale, in a later interview, admitted, "I thought I was leading the conversation, but she was always a step ahead. She knew exactly what she was doing, and that's a kind of leadership in itself." Perhaps Melania hadn't changed overnight, but the way people viewed her had. Whether one admired her or questioned her, she had proven that power doesn't always come from making the loudest statement. Instead, true power can be found in knowing when to speak, when to listen, and when to let your presence do all the talking. The story of Melania Trump's poised and strategic handling of a high-pressure interview teaches a valuable lesson about the power of composure, confidence, and self-awareness in the face of scrutiny. In a world where loud voices and heated debates often dominate public discourse, Melania's approach demonstrated that true strength doesn't always come from shouting the loudest. It comes from knowing when to speak and when to let your presence command the room. Her ability to deflect hostility without appearing defensive, to challenge assumptions without engaging in conflict, and to turn an interrogation into a moment of control reveals the importance of measured responses in leadership and public life. Many people, when placed in high-stakes situations, feel pressured to react emotionally or aggressively, but Melania's approach proves that sometimes grace under pressure can be more powerful than a counterattack. Furthermore, the story highlights the impact of perception. How the world views a person can change in an instant depending on how they handle adversity. By refusing to be rattled, Melania reshaped her own narrative, proving that sometimes silence is not avoidance, but a strategic tool for maintaining authority. Ultimately, the lesson is clear. Confidence isn't about proving yourself to others. It's about knowing who you are and standing firm, no matter how much the world tries to shake you.